So we have the Aussie Drivesbone, we have the Akubra, we have an awful Aussie accent I'll get castigated for by my cousins, but we're off to Australia with my cousin Stephen to recreate our grandfather's trip on a Harley Davidson 1000cc 100 years ago. Still, guess I better change the Akubra for a helmet before I set off. Right, good morning. Today we're going to try a little test, taking the Tiger up one of the more difficult slopes to see how ready we are for Australia. I did this a couple of times when it was drier, and that was more difficult because the gravel slipped an awful lot more. And here we go, riding in Les Marques, shortcut on the slopes. And you better try and stay on the bike. I've been biking for like 12, 13 years. Started when I was 54. We hadn't biked before because my mother was a nurse at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, and she'd seen too many young men die in the war, and she didn't like seeing too many young men suffering from motorcycle injuries, because of course that was the early 50s, and that was before crash helmets were compulsory. So obviously my grandfather was not a crash helmet person, or if it was maybe a leather cap or something. And so when my mother died, she left a little money, and I used that to get some motorcycle lessons and a bike. That was on the advice of my friend Michael, who helped me out enormously, because it was a bit of a difficult 2 years. First, two Maramani, our two dogs, were poisoned by the local shepherd. That was bad. Then my wife left and got a job in Frankfurt and didn't come back very much from that. My mother got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She died the next January. My sister got, her breast cancer came back, and she died the next January, and my father died in the February. So we've lost quite a lot then, and so I was not in a good way looking after the triplets pretty much single-handedly, and they were early teenagers. Anyway, Michael helped me out enormously, and because he'd got a motorbike a couple of years before, he rightly suggested that going biking together could be fun. So we gave it a go, and here we are. Get some revs going. It's probably quite bumpy on the camera. Let's see how we go. Give it a bit of willy. Get a bit of willy. Okay. At least the mud's not too muddy. And we come through the most difficult part. Well, a lot easier than doing the 80 kilometres of deep gravel we did in Patagonia last year. No idea if the camera's picking up the town of Montelubiano at the top. By the way, I'm standing on the pegs because it's quite steep. Hello, Mika. Yes, so got the motorcycle license in the June and had booked on a trip with Michael to India. What you call? And we went, I think it was in the September, on a charity run. And out in, we're full of wildlife today. Hello geese. And yeah, we were riding very old bullets. The Nomadic Nights. Alex Perry's Nomadic Nights. I've done 5 trips with them, 4 trips. Absolutely superb. And funnily enough, the last trip we did on the roof of India, we were on Himalayas. And my cousin Stephen has a Himalaya, and that's one of the bikes we'll be riding in Australia. He wanted to change it in for another bike, and sensibly decided he'd buy the other bike first and trade in the Himalaya after we'd done our rides. And of course, to follow grandfather, Stephen bought a Harley. Now I'm pretty sure they'll be very different machines. Grandfather had a Harley 1000cc. Cousin Stephen's got himself a 1200. You can bet the capabilities will be very, very different. It's quite windy, so I don't know if we're having to cut this off. Well, the mic is absolutely superb. You can pick me up while we're riding home. So, done lots of motorbiking. Our first tour was in South India. We did it with Adventure Ashram, and we raised a bunch of money to, it's mainly Michael and his friend William, who raised an awful lot of it. I think there were 4 of us, and we took something like 25,000 euros with us to help a boys' home out there build a new dining room and kitchen. And the boys' home was an offshoot of the girls' home, which had been started, I think, something like 10 years before by 2 journalists who were writing about prostitutes in one of the big local towns, and realised that lots of them were victims of human trafficking. And they set up a home so they could rescue these girls. And then they came up against the difficulty of, like most states, nobody wants to recognise the trafficking's going on. And obviously the criminals wanted their girls back. And they couldn't take the girls back to the families because the families would just sell them again. It was very, very emotional going and seeing these places, seeing the wonderful work they've been doing. And, very grateful to help. And that was a major purpose. And then we went to a tiger reserve where charity had been buying buses to get school children to school, because walking to school in a tiger reserve is not a very good long-term option. That was fascinating. And of course I was pretty much a novice, and the old 500 bullets were a handful for me. You had to pump this and turn that lever and hope this worked and that worked, and the gear change was on a different side, and it was very old school stuff, and I was pretty crap at it. There we are. And then a couple of years later we went on Alex's 3 Mile High trip, and we rode in the Himalayas up to 3 miles high, one of the highest passes there. That was superb, but again it was on bullets, so again I kept falling off. Yeah, I had a bit of a difficult one there because avoided young girl who stepped out in the road, hit a pothole and the front fork snapped. And it was quite difficult to hold the bike up when the front forks were snapped. So I left a chunk of my hip on the road there. But we carried on and we kept getting better. And we had a wonderful trip in the Lost World, which you can't really go to now, but that's the 7 eastern states of India, almost cut off from the rest of it. But we started off in Assam and went up to the border with Bhutan and then down to the border with Burma. So from the Himalayas down to the jungles. And that was a fascinating trip. There's a civil war going on there, or pretty close to a civil war going on there. And when we went, I think we went in about April, and we were something like the 10th tourists in the area because you had to sign in at the local police station. And that was fascinating. And we saw the Battle of the Tennis Court. Yeah, I might put a link to that in the description or something, but the Battle of the Tennis Court was Second World War. It's where the Allies, or the Brits in this case, stopped the German advance. And we ended up with trenches on either side of a tennis court, lobbing grenades at each other. The Brits were pretty much surrounded. And the tennis court was of the old, whatever they call it, I've forgotten the word now. Anyway, the old colonial boss of the area. And they managed to dislodge the Japanese. And my understanding is that a lot of the Japanese died of starvation on the way home, as well as sickness and injury. But it was emotional going to the gravesite there and seeing how many young men had been killed. But that was a fascinating trip, going from the Himalayas to the jungles. And then a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to do the ride of India, the roof of India, to ride the roof of India. And we went from Shimla all the way up to the Pakistani border in Kashmir. And Kashmir was fascinating. I've been to Kashmir, but when I went last time, it was on the other side of the border. It was back in about 1995. I've been invited to go and have a look in the Himalayas. Fascinating trip. And pretty sure we went to Kargil, which was Pakistan then and India now. Here we are, back home. And that was fun. Okay, hope you have a wonderful day.